שלום וברוכים הבאים לפסטיבל דוק אביב ה-22 ולתחרות עומק שדה. אנו שמחים לארח בפסטיבל את קורטני סטיבנס ופאצ'ו ולז בימי הסרט אמריקן סקטור. אנחנו נעשה עכשיו שיחה באורך של חצי שעה. אנחנו מאוד מאוד מזמינים אתכם להשאיר לנו שאלות באזור ה-Q&A. זה אייקון שאתם רואים מצד ימין באמצע של המסך למטה. בבקשה אל תשתמשו באזור הצ'אט. ועכשיו באנגלית. Welcome to the 22nd Doc Aviv Film Festival and to the Depth of Field competition. We're honored to have here with us Courtney Stevens and Pacho Velez, the filmmakers of the American sector. The webinar would last 30 minutes. Please leave questions in the Q&A section. It's in the bottom of the screen, center right. Please do not use the chat functions. So hi, good evening or good afternoon, I think, with you. I want to start with a very simple question. How did you get to do a film that documents pieces of stone scattered all over the US?
It grew out of a project that I made previously about Ronald Reagan. And I spent a lot of time at the Reagan Presidential Library where they have a piece of the wall and all the researchers eat lunch right next to it. And people just say the most outrageous things about this wall. They pass it and they sort of make up all kinds of stories, but also like sometimes it triggers, so it's both like pieces of history, but also memories. Some people who were maybe served in the US military talk about it and visiting it when it was in East Germany, in West Germany. Other people talk about remembering it when it came down, and there's just all this sort of rhetoric around this piece of concrete, this hunk of concrete, and just started thinking about where else in the world, where else in the US had these pieces, and what other sorts of stories were being woven around them. And Courtney was living in Los Angeles at the time, and that's also where the Reagan Presidential Library is. And we just got to talking about this. And Courtney, if you'd like to talk more about your
working on it. I think this was right around Trump's election. So this was 4 years ago. And we would sketch out these maps. We started trying to identify where these were. And of course, they kept coming out of the woodwork. But I think in the beginning of, we would go on these road trips for maybe a week at a time and cover ground and, try to shoot what we could. And we thought, we were making this film where we would have a voiceover and we would, it would be sort of educational. And in the end, as you see, what people said and the just kind of randomness of, experience and shooting and life made for a much more interesting film. So it took a long time to shoot, and it was fun. And we got to see the whole country.
And how did you find these pieces? I mean, is there like some project that document them or collect them? How did you get the information about where they are?
There were already some people who had created some web compendiums of this stuff. So we had that to start with, but it was often that we would be at one institution and they would know about, there was a kind of network of curators who would know about other institutions. We'd be tipped off by somebody who said, oh, it's in a private club that I belong to. So some of it was just word of mouth, especially the private owners. There's some in LA. But also these things move. So they actually, it wasn't as you wouldn't assume that a 3-ton object was hard to catch, but sometimes they would be gone by the time we would try to shoot.
It would be circulating. Yes, there was a children's museum in North Carolina that had one, but by the time we got down there, it had gone. They actually weren't certain exactly where it had ended up going to. They returned it to whoever had loaned it to them, and those people turned out to be impossible to get in touch with. And we also saw some for sale. We saw museums also, like there was a guy in Georgia who's in the film that you all saw, but he bought his at a bankruptcy auction.
The restaurant guy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and just that was just a sort of happenstance. 5 years ago, he went to an auction for fun, and left with a piece of the Berlin Wall, and then what do you do with it? You know, where do you stick that?
There's actually an open mystery about a piece at the Bill Clinton that was intended for the Bill Clinton Library that's gone missing.
It disappeared out of storage as they were building the Clinton Presidential Library.
Like someone stole it?
Yeah, or they misplaced it.
I mean, I'm very curious about, Courtney, you saying that you thought to do one film which is more like voiceover and more didactic in a way of you kind of like, you know, maybe verbalizing what the wall is meant to do, and then this turned into something else where people actually, you know, talk about their experience, you know, even like some banal and everyday experience of, you know, passing the wall on their day to work or on campus or things like this. So I want to ask you about this moment where you realize that it's not going to be the film that you planned and it's going to be something else that more has to do with the way different people around this artifact are actually narrating what it means to them.
Yeah, so on the way we divided labor on set was Pacha was shooting and I was doing sound. And so I think it happened really early. Maybe our first trip we went to, it's not in the film, but we went to a military school in Monterey, where it's a language school for soldiers learning other languages. And it was, you know, I was doing sound, but more just kind of hanging out with our guide, you know, the sort of minder who had been assigned to us. And so we were shooting from an area where some soldiers were having a barbecue. None of this is in the film, but I think it was that moment where I was just listening to them do their barbecue. They were asking, you know, what are you doing? Oh, we're shooting the wall. Oh, I never even noticed it. Oh, yeah. And it was, you know, sort of listening to this and just understanding, this is the heart of the matter, you know. And anything, any amount of analysis, which of course we had going in, and we had our biases, we had our political perspectives and whatever, was never going to be as, if the subject of the film is about the meaning of this thing in this place, it felt that we would never be as creative as, you know, the world coughing up its stuff, you know. Sounds a little gross.
And I mean, you mentioned that there are like parts that are not in the film. I mean, not just parts of shooting, but parts of the wall. I mean, can you say a little bit about the one that you decided to omit or not to include?
Yeah, we have about 45 in the film, and I think the total number in the US is around 70. And we shot almost all. There were like 4 or 5 that we couldn't for various reasons. But so, I mean, I think it was a matter of, some of them are in the credits. You see them rolling over, you know, as footage over the credits. A lot of the reasons that they weren't in was, you know, maybe just they repeated a certain kind of point. There are a lot on college campuses, for example. So, you know, yeah, maybe we should do a second edition of the film. I'm not sure.
No, but it was just, at some point, like, you can only see so many Midwestern college campuses. You can only see so many military installations. You know, it's like one of those stands in for 4 places that all look more or less the same. And that it felt, as we were editing, it felt more important to give a sense of all the different variety of places that feature the wall, rather than a more sort of maybe like strictly educational approach that was like, this is every single piece, and, you know, even if it's boring, you're going to see it, you know. I think it came out of like a respect for the audience and their time a little bit too.
I mean, you know, I saw your film and I was thinking that monuments are very interesting because as much as they provoke a certain history, they also silence other parts of it. And part of the reason why, you know, it came up to me so strongly has to do with, I mean, where I am right now. So I'm sitting in a building called the IG Farben in Frankfurt, which has this long, I mean, it's a monument in itself, very much attached to history of Germany in the 20th century, but one of its major role was that this was the headquarters of US military in Frankfurt after the American occupation. And, you know, I think like a few hundred meters from here There is still, a neighborhood populated with American soldiers. I think Frankfurt is the most populated European city in terms of the presence of US military. So for me, it was quite striking that there was no mention of the wall part in an active American occupation. I mean, I want to ask you about all the things that the wall dabs or brings out, but actually I want to start by asking you about what it silenced or what is not remembered or what it helps to forget even.
Sure. No, please.
I think so. One question in terms of the scope of the film that we were contending with while editing was just, to what extent is this film about international relations? To what extent is it about Germany? To what extent is it about Russia and the Cold War? So at some point we had to rein in that the film was about America and about American self-regard and about the stories America tells itself about itself. And sometimes those have to do with the way that America tells stories about America abroad, and its virtuousness, or usually. So I think that the idea of getting the history right, we realized pretty early on. We were never going to construct something that was also an accurate representation of history. It could only be a representation of kind of associational meaning, or reflexive history.
Yeah, and fragments. I mean, the film is a film very sort of knowingly constructed out of shards of history, shards of the wall, shards of America, shards of personalities, people's voices. That what you're getting is not a wall as constructed, but a sort of but a wall as fallen apart. I mean, deconstructed is I'm going to avoid that word, but like something about like it's like the rubble of this barrier.
I think a lot of longing inside, the film for a certain picture of America. So the idea that that it avoids a complex picture is almost, one of the points I think that we came to, in doing this, is that the wall in the imagination, I think, is a binary. It provides a binary, which is why it's such an attractive symbol, right? And that binary doesn't leave a lot of room for the colossal messiness of the 20th century.
And I think also an important sort of formal point in the film for us in terms of acknowledging the limits of our approach, and the limits of what representation can even really do, is hopefully the scene with the CIA and this sort of very intentional moment where you're sitting there for 2 minutes in black. And there are these sites that are off limits for one reason or another. You're hearing about this particular reason that this particular piece is off limits, but there's also sort of aspects of American history that are off limits, in the sense that it's given our approach, talking to people, the limits of what we can get are the limits of what people are prepared to tell us. And it's a dialogic approach, and acknowledging those constraints were important to us. I mean, that said, hopefully some part of the American military abroad is inside the film, and the sorts of things that the American military abroad gets up to. The man at Fort Leavenworth. So Fort Leavenworth, this is maybe more U.S. specific knowledge, but that fort was where Lewis and Clark left on their expedition to map the American West, and so it's a very important place in the sort of the creation of American Manifest Destiny and sort of every westward expansion, you know, the genocide against Native Americans, and this this retired soldier there who talks about the wars that he's participated in abroad, and now he's done. He just wants to fish. You know, it's subtle, but hopefully there's a way that's about a kind of American exhaustion with empire.
I mean, yeah, because for me, what is interesting, or a question that I think actually comes out so beautifully in your film, is not only how we document memory and its different versions, but also how we document forgetfulness, which is the other side of it, right? And I think it's especially interesting, and maybe you can say more about how do you think the film resonates in the US today? I mean, you mentioned that you started shooting when Trump was elected, but for me, you know, hearing US discourse these days, I mean, there is so much about like revisiting history and think about the things we forgot or we didn't see. And it comes out so beautifully in the sequence in the campus where they talk, oh, you know, we have the wall here, but you know, how do we remember slavery?
Sure.
So if you can say a little bit about how do you think the film resonates today, or maybe some interactions you had around it with American audiences.
You know, we can't even tell you because we actually haven't had our American premiere yet. We're going to be playing a couple of festivals next month, so we're really excited. But I think that, you know, of the people who have looked at the film and, you know, how we're thinking about it, I mean, yeah, certainly Trump's you know, Make America Great Again is 100% directly about American nostalgia for an imagined past, you know, the good old days, bad old days, and, you know, America's kind of like eternal preoccupation with the 1950s and this kind of post-war period is also, you know, part of something that somehow cannot die here, you know, and is more and more a kind of source of violence. I saw a newspaper article the other day that it was one of these, the protests around not wearing masks here, which are happening or have been happening. And it said social distancing equals communism. And I just thought, you know, wow. But you know, we can't leave. We just can't leave the Cold War. I think it's scary to walk away from that space inside the American psyche. It's almost a no man's land outside of that.
There's something really nice about, we're talking about sort of the present moment, but this way that the past infuses the landscape, right? And obviously America's a young country, and there's all kinds of, I mean, as I will not talk about Israel and the history of Israel, but just the way that, like, it's both geography, but it's also these like traces of history inside of it. And this is like a slight digression, but I think touches on the ways in which history can be denied, but still crops up. Just before this, I was teaching a class, and today is actually something called a scholar strike in the US. So we're in solidarity with Black Lives Matter and what's happening in Kenosha. We're actually not supposed to teach today. So we held the class, but then rather than teaching the lesson, we had a sort of round table where people discussed their own recent experiences with anti-Black racism around the country. And this one student was telling a story. She was a white woman about her relatives, and her relatives, I forget something. There was something about them, and she was just telling the story, and she kept going like this. And right behind her on the wall was a Confederate flag. And she was sort of talking about how bad, how she really thought that racism was something that had to be fought in America. And one of the African-American students in the class interrupted her and actually said, is that a Confederate flag behind you? And she turns around and is like, Oh my God. Yeah, I'm at my sister's house. She went to Ole Miss, which is a university in the South, and this flag was on the Ole Miss, was part of the Ole Miss sort of branding. And she's like, I'm so embarrassed. And the African American student was like, you realize like how hurtful this is, and like the fact that like, you know, 150 of us are sitting here watching you have this conversation, and nobody's even prepared to sort of point out this like obvious discrepancy, but also it's there. It's like, it's still, it like pops up even inside. Yeah, I haven't totally pieced out exactly what the takeaway from that story is, but it was a striking moment this morning.
I mean, it resonates for me a lot of the conversations that happen around Monument in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And I think actually I mean, for me, the film also really resonates things that happen in Israel and in Germany. But let's stay for a minute
Sure.
in the US. And I'm thinking about all these conversations that happen around monuments. Some people say, you know, these monuments stand for a hurtful and painful history, and I want them to be removed. And some people say, no, but they're here because we need to remember this history, right? Mm-hmm. Or even some people say, yeah, you know, they stand for history, but also they're so much part of our daily life.
Sure.
You know, we used to see the statue on our way to work, so why to remove it? Mm-hmm. And I mean, so being aware of this conversation, how do you feel about these pieces of the Berlin Wall? I must say that for me, at the beginning, they seem so perverse, mm-hmm. And also, I mean, once again, it's not that I want to verbalize here any kind of a German side, because I'm not associated to it, but I was like, wait, but this is like another country's concrete. But toward the end of the film, I actually was like, oh, wow, these pieces are so charged. And I like the complexity that they brought about, even the one that felt to me disturbing or harmful. So I was very ambivalent at the end of the film about how I feel about these objects. And I wanted to ask you how you felt after this very long process of shooting and talking to people.
Well, I think specifically to that point about, because I mean, we asked ourselves many times, are these statues, you know, I mean, to what extent are these, because they have a kind of ontological strangeness, right? I mean, they are installed sort of as minimalist art objects in a lot of places, you know, they function almost as like a sculpture garden, you know, object. But the thing about them that is different than, say, like a Confederate statue is that their representational capacity is open. They're reflective. They do nothing. They are like, you know, they're a slab of gray, you know, shape. And so, you know, it's like conceptually perfect in this idea that it is sculpted through the kind of, you know, reflection onto media history and all these kinds of other things. I mean, I will say that while we were shooting, you know, that conversation was happening. It's been happening this year. And it was also happening 2.5 years ago at some point when we were shooting in the South. We actually visited a lot of those statues when they were, yeah, there was a lot of consternation in neighborhoods who either liked them, that they were getting graffitied, that they were putting up boundaries around it. There was all sorts of stuff going on. And at that time, a lot of people were, well, I don't know, Patrick, you continue with it.
Oh, well, I mean, for me, just one of the things about visiting those Confederate war memorials, what it makes clear, right, is this way that like representation is a form of implicit endorsement, or that's what the public assumes, you know, that I'm seeing General Lee on a horse. Whoever built the society, you know, is celebrating this person and this history. But there's an irony to having a piece of the Berlin Wall, because nobody's celebrating the wall exactly, right? Like it's not, nobody's like, that was a great thing. What a wonderful thing. We need more of that. So it's actually sort of, they're celebrating its dissolution. They're celebrating the fact that it's no longer where it was. And so there's like an irony built into the representation, which contributes to the sense of it almost feeling like a contemporary art object, too, in these certain places. Yeah, and it's also like, where else are we going with this?
I mean, can I intervene and
Yeah,
ask?
please.
Because it's really interesting for me the way you talk about it, the two of you, because there is a question about, it's a piece of a wall. I think that there was even one frame, maybe it was the highway, where it took me a minute to kind of like identify, although the wall was at the center of the frame.
Sure.
So it's a bit different than as a statue. It's a bit different than or let's say it's a different than a statue of a man on a horse,
Sure.
or a military general on a horse.
But it's also a war trophy. I mean, right? There's no way of getting around this idea that it is a lawn ornament that says we won the Cold War in many places. That is a bit how it's functioning. Or, at these presidential libraries, while it may not be the man himself, it is functioning as a legacy building object, right? So it's saying George H.W. Bush was a great man in this way, right? So it is it's appropriated in that way, and it's sort of seemingly infinitely appropriatable, which is I think what we started finding.
And it's a gesture of empire too. It's this sort of this sense of a spoil of war, right? Like, it makes me think about Roman triumphs where the emperor would parade the Gallic chieftains, down the main thoroughfare in ancient Rome, along with all these sort of objects captured on the during the campaign. There's something just like that. We went there, we took this thing down, and now we're going to display our power, our might back home.
I mean, we're approaching the end, unfortunately, because I still have so many questions to ask you, but I do want to ask you, I mean, yeah, something strange happened with films this year. It didn't necessarily reach their audiences in time.
Sure.
Although maybe there is no right time. But I know you did have the chance to premiere the film in Berlin, of all places. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about the response you got to the film in Berlin when you presented this film.
I mean, it was positive. It was a positive experience. But there was also, I mean, I think the more interesting reception was usually we would be interviewed by media outlets, and a lot of the people that we were dealing with directly through that had grown up in the East, or had processed this history in ways that, I mean, I guess that's the interesting thing, is that Germany has had 30 years to process this, and America actually has not, and is still thinks of these fissures as more real. I've never really articulated that, but that it does feel like past history actually in Germany in a much different way than it does in America, and that was striking to me.
It was our first time in Germany too. Neither of us had visited before. And just walking around Berlin, there's so many pieces of the Berlin Wall still there. So it's just this sort of commonplace for them. And they were kind of tickled that it was that Americans thought it was rare and special, which was kind of interesting.
I mean, it's interesting what you're saying also, because German society approach to monument is very, very different, and not triumphant at all. I keep thinking about it whenever I stumble on one of those, I don't know how to call them, like pedal stones that you have with names of victims of the Nazi regime.
Okay.
It's so. I keep thinking about how the approach here toward monument is very different. Monuments are normally they're not triumphant at all. And
That's interesting.
Yes. And it's also interesting that, I mean, and I unfortunately will have to end with this, but I mean, this is kind of like to drive it back home being Israel, my home. It's a difference between a state that is celebrating this history, which is a tool for imperialism and colonization, versus a state that is trying to come to terms with a very painful past where the state itself has been the perpetrator.
Sure.
And just with this insight, I want to thank you for this fantastic film that I'm going to keep thinking about, and I think also really resonate for Israeli audiences in the way it depicts history, but also in the way it think about a wall.
Sure.
And yeah.
Can I jump in and say one thing? I mean, I do think that, you know, interestingly, this thing that it did sort of unlock or sort of like unhinge certain traumatic, and I think, you know, that's kind of what happens as the film goes on, is that these traumas are there, they're in the landscape, they're in the land itself. And it was, you know, this catalyst can't help but expose all of that, you know, here in this country as well. So yeah, this kind of,
and I think that this dialectic of memory is something that you're really able to capture in your film so greatly. I mean, as I said at the beginning, it sounds a bit off because you see all this celebration, but then you also see how it is playing into much more nuanced historical narratives and much more contested historical narratives. And yeah, also very traumatic and painful historical narratives. Yeah.
Well, I mean, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to have the conversation with us. And also, we'd love to just say if anybody on the call would like to get in touch with us, our email is americansectorfilm@gmail.com, and we're happy to talk with anyone more.
Yeah, I want to emphasize this call because, I mean, as you know, the webinar is being recorded and it's going to be on the DocViv website. We'll be happy to hear from you. You can contact the festival and we'll make sure to forward the questions to Patrick and Courtney, or of course, contact them directly. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks.